Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our session, Why Data Literacy is Important for Future Business Leaders, with our special guests, Professor Gray Hunter, Lecturer of Economics, and Professor Matthew Hashim, Associate Professor of MIS at Eller College of Management, University of Arizona. My name is Alexander. I'm a part of the higher education team here at IVExec, and I will be helping to moderate today's session. Before we begin, I have a few brief housekeeping items for our audience. First, all attendees are in listen-only mode. However, we encourage you to engage in the session by asking questions, which you can do using the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. Please make sure to use this feature for all the questions you may have for the presenters, while we invite you to use the in-chat feature for sharing any thoughts you may have with the rest of the audience. We'll be also having a formal Q&A session, so please feel free to send in your questions throughout the session. Additionally, we're recording today's session, so you can look forward to receiving a copy of a recording via email in the coming days. And now, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our presenters, Professors Hunter and Hashim. Gray Hunter is a lecturer of economics at Eller College of Management, University of Arizona. He earned a doctorate in economics from the University of Kentucky in 2017. He teaches courses in statistics, business analytics, intermediate microeconomics and macroeconomics, and the economics of sports. He has twice been named Instructor of the Year for his large lecture courses. His research interests are in public and labor economics, with an emphasis on educational expectations and workforce preparedness. He has published his own textbook on business analytics, presented at various conferences, and has led several small seminars for various private firms. Matthew Hashim joined the Eller College of Management in 2011 after earning his PhD in Management Information Systems from Purdue University. He brings with him vast industry experience in the information technology field, including working as a network administrator, programmer, and systems management manager. His research is focused around information security and privacy, digital piracy, experimental and behavioral economics, and electronic commerce. Welcome, professors.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having us, and happy Wednesday, everyone. So today we've got a presentation for you about data literacy, and this is one of those topics that is relevant for anyone, regardless of the stage of their career. So, Gray, do you want to move forward here? And you'll see as we go through this presentation, Gray and I are going to go back and forth a bit. So hopefully we'll keep everyone on their toes, but certainly we'll have some Q&A, as Alexander mentioned, at the end. And then if there are other, we'll have some polls throughout the presentation. And if there are other questions or comments, please coordinate with Alexander through the chat. So a brief outline of our presentation today. First, we got to define the problem, define the topic of interest, data literacy, of course, and how important data is. From there, we'll move into decision making with data, then talk about some emerging or emergent topics and technologies. Then we'll look at the current data needs in both business and education, and how we at Eller are trying to take a data-driven approach, at least from the education perspective, so that we can better prepare our managers entering the workforce.
Perfect. Thanks, Matt. And again, thank you all for having me. And so we first have to kind of, as Matt said, define, well, what is data literacy? It's sort of a very loaded term. And so we've tried to simplify it for this presentation. When we're talking about data literacy, we want you to kind of think of, all right, it's the ability to read, understand, work with, analyze, and communicate with data. And while that seems very simple, right, hopefully you'll kind of learn over the next 40-ish minutes with us that it's actually a very complicated problem, but also a very valuable skill to have and build for any sort of future or even current business leader. Right? And so why are we actually giving this presentation today? And a big part of it stems with, well, data has been shown to be valuable. And I always show this to my undergraduate and MBA classes, where I kind of start with, right, the world's most valuable resource is no longer oil, right? So when we pull out of the ground, or diamonds or gold, but it's data. And it's got value because firms are willing to pay for it. They're using it to make big decisions to hopefully drive value of the firm. And so you've got kind of all the big names that people are familiar with: Amazon, Uber, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Tesla. And we'll get into how a lot of these firms are using data to kind of make decisions. And you'll kind of see, well, we've advanced technologically to where it's actually much easier to work with data. And so we love this article from the Wall Street Journal that talks about every business is now a technology business, because part of it is utilizing sort of data they collect, or advertising or branding or anything like that. So those are kind of the two common themes that you'll see throughout this entire presentation. All right, and if you don't believe us here, we've kind of compiled a set of quotes that kind of back us up here. So, and we've kind of hit the most reputable ones or the most notable ones to hopefully, again, give us some credibility. So we have from the Harvard Business School, right? Data has been one of the greatest drivers of innovation in business and society in recent decades, right? From MIT, right? Top performing organizations are using analytics 5 times more than bottom performers. Without data literacy, leaders can't thrive in an analytics sort of driven economy. And it kind of goes on and on and on about the various ways that data is important, whether it's outcome based or using it to make decisions, right? And how we kind of deal with it. And I really like the last quote because it's this new problem that's developed as we've gotten better at collecting data and realizing its value, where it talks about understanding patterns in the oceans of data, right? The data that we're now producing by all the firms that are collecting it. And so now I'll kind of turn it over to Matt to talk about that.
Yeah, so Gray, I think that's interesting. You talk about the oceans of data and all this, and data's value. And if you will see in this image here, data is power, right? As shown by press and by industry as well. Well, reflect on your own organizations, and we can reflect on ourselves here in education as well. What do you do with all this data? Where is the data coming from? Is it that so-called deluge, as the economists and the ACM have said? We've gotten to the point, many of us, that there's so much data out there and available to us, we don't know what to do with it, or it's coming in so quickly we can't ask relevant questions of it in a timely manner so that we can make better decisions. And so, yeah, data creates value. I think Gray has convinced all of us of that, but how can we use it? So as we move from what we call data to action, and this is not from us, this is out there in the industry. This particular figure here is from Gartner, but this has been out there for many years now. We think about how making use of data, and when we think about making use of data, we can ask 4 different questions, and these start from the most simplest and lowest value types of data or use of data to the most complicated and highest value uses of data. So if you think about these questions, what happened? We can look reflectively in terms of collecting some data and seeing what happened. Maybe we can make some changes for the future. Then if you get a little bit more complicated, you might say, well, okay, we know what happened, but can we predict or can we determine why it happened? And that's what we would call a diagnostic type of analytic or a diagnostic type of use of data. Then as we continue moving up this value and difficulty figure here, we get into what we call predictive analytics, and that's a term that we've heard for many years now. I'm sure many of you have heard this term as well. Okay, predictive analytics, what will happen? And oftentimes we use complicated statistical models to figure that out. Now, the most complicated part here, and I guess I should back up a little bit, this is not easy. None of this is easy. And I know we've kind of alluded to that throughout this presentation so far, but this is not trivial. This is not easy. This takes work. This takes training. This takes expertise. So again, as we move up towards highest value, we think about prescriptive analytics. And I think the best example I can give of that, if any of you are, you do shopping, online shopping, or you watch movies on various platforms like Netflix, well, they give you pretty accurate recommendations, right? They're trying to steer you towards things that you will consume. And so recommender systems is a very complicated type of algorithms that have been created by organizations that leverage prescriptive analytics, like how can we make it happen? And so they're driving you towards particular types of consumption. So now we'll jump. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, so we want to get to know you all a little bit better and keep you involved. And so, Alex, if you don't mind launching a poll where we're going to try and figure out how you perceive your firm. How do you think your firm is using data, or is it using data to drive decisions?
Okay, so we're going to launch the poll now. Okay, and we have 15 more seconds. Okay, and we're closing the poll. And here are the results. Out of 63% that voted, 15 said almost always, 30% said sometimes, and 55% said we could do more.
That sounds, we appreciate the honesty, right? I mean, that sounds about right. We could do more. I think nearly any firm can do more because we mentioned earlier on, right, that deluge of data. We also know that skill sets like data scientists or data analysts or business analysts are in super high demand right now because there are so many openings within firms and organizations looking for that expertise to help them do more. Now, those of you that said almost always, that's awesome. You're definitely in the minority. But that said, there are some very highly advanced organizations and firms that really understand their data, and you know what? Because of that, there are winners and there are losers in any industry because of their ability to leverage their data.
Yeah, and so that kind of leads into the next one. So if your firm is kind of doing data work or working with data, based upon kind of the visual that we've outlined, how are they using it sort of on the scale? So Alex, do you want to launch the second poll?
Okay, here we go with the second poll. Okay, and we'll give it 15 more seconds. And we're closing the poll. Okay, right. Out of 63% that voted, 35% said what happened, 38% said why did it happen, 10% said what will happen, 8% how can we make it happen, and 10% said did something happen.
Okay, I mean that also seems quite reasonable and representative of what we might expect with the majority, in those first two layers of the descriptive and diagnostic types of analytics, leveraging some statistics, some of you kind of getting up into the more advanced analytics. So that's great.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have kind of examples of now how other firms are working with their data, so along that kind of spectrum. And so what happened and why? So a case study that I always kind of use in my classes, when Uber was first coming out, they analyzed their data from 2015 to 2017. So around 1.8 million drivers, 740 million trips were in the data. And just sort of looking at a surface level, they found that male drivers made 7% more per hour than female drivers on average. And on the surface, that's a huge issue, right? If there's a gender kind of pay gap that's going on at Uber, they want to address that, right? They want to make sure that the algorithm that they have or anything like that isn't causing this gap to appear. So they dove into their data and they found that actually that 7% gap was driven by three things. Number one, where male versus female drivers chose to drive and win. So men were typically in the more surge areas. 30% was based upon attrition and experience. So men tend to stick with the app longer. So they figured out those better routes, the higher paying routes. And the big one, which most people don't guess, is speed, right? There's the reason men typically pay more for car insurance. We drive faster, right? And we pay for it. And well, when we drive faster, we can do more rides. And so they actually looked at their data just to make sure, right, that they weren't sort of violating anything like that, which was very, very helpful to them in terms of their analytics. And then another case is eBay. So in 2011, eBay was spending around $1 billion on marketing, right? And really, they had never kind of asked that question is, well, is it effective? They had this assumption of a small section of it that around 5% of sales were driven by paid search advertising. So if you're ever on Google and you always see those first 10 searches that are ad, right? The firms were paying for that, and eBay did that. And eventually they stepped back and said, is that actually working? And they found that actually, no, it wasn't, right? Every dollar that they were spending on that paid search advertising, they were losing 60 cents. And so their CEO immediately reduced spending on the paid advertising by $100 million. And a lot of that's because they were an established brand by then. Like if you're looking for eBay, you're not going to click on a random sort of link at the top. You will just go to the bottom, find eBay, and go through. And so that's how they were kind of using their data. It's like, all right, what happened? Why was it happening? And I'll turn it over to Matt to kind of talk about the other two.
Yeah, and as we move up the ladder towards the advanced analytics, and let's say we think of predictive analytics, these next two examples will be about predictive analytics. Consumer retail is one that's has created a lot of value out of their data. And there's a quote here from a Nike employee. There's a lot of talk about how much we need data, but actually we need the right data. And we use some serious analytics behind it to turn it into value creation. And hopefully you can all put yourselves in that same situation in your organizations, thinking about the right data. You can ask and explore your data as much as you want, but if it's not the right data, you will not be able to answer the question that you're trying to answer. In the particular case of Nike, they wanted to identify relationships between the variables, the types of data that they had, and then predict things like preferences, segmentations in the market, predict where they should build new stores and provide retail outlets for consumers, predict when to rotate and refresh inventory, and then also make use of advanced things like various types of sensors. But in order to do these types of things, they would have to have the right kind of data, let's say, for example, to figure out where to build stores. So they might need some GIS or geographical information systems type data, along with consumer spending habits and various zip codes or other types of consumer data like that. So great, let's go to the next one. One of the other examples that many of us like to give, and maybe you've heard of this one. This one's been around for quite a bit, but this is a type of predictive analytics that I think can be quite shocking, depending on your experiences here and your privacy preferences. Target, many years ago, or about a decade ago or so, got into some trouble. And they got into some trouble because they were really good at predictive analytics. And what they did is they started exploring and finding patterns among their data. And so if you think about going to a retailer such as Target, and I've got children, and I've been through this process several times with my own family. But you go, and as someone becomes pregnant, they determine that they're pregnant, right, through a test. Maybe they start gaining some weight, baby weight and so forth. So then they need looser clothes, or maybe they need a comfortable chair, or maybe they need prenatal vitamins, and they start buying these things in particular time series, right, in a particular order. Well, Target recognized that, and they put together what they called a pregnancy prediction score. And about a decade ago, they could predict a due date for a baby within a few weeks. They're probably within a few days with current technology. Well, that's amazing, right? If you know what your customer wants and when they want it, that's a win for the retailer because that customer is buying products from that retailer. That's a win for the consumer because the consumer gets, let's say, a coupon or targeted, sorry for the word targeted there, but targeted information about the things that they are most likely interested in. Well, where does that become a problem? The problem comes when you make it too obvious, right? Gray, do you want to show the next quote here? So in this particular case, and where Target got in some trouble with this, is they were sending out, paper coupons at the time, and they sent paper coupons to a young lady, and she was a teenager, and her parents saw these paper coupons, and they were all pretty much about pregnancy-related products, things that she might desire to purchase. Well, that caused some issues within that household because the family, her parents, did not know that she was expecting. And so it was too obvious of a advertisement in this particular case. They were too good at predicting it, but the challenge was they did not mix in what we would call a randomized advertisement. We've learned from this, organizations have learned from this. So now in the particular case like this one, is that valuable that an organization knows that someone is expecting? Absolutely. Should they make it obvious? No, right? They absolutely should not. And so what retailers have done now is they still give you those coupons that you want, and you're seeing those on your apps now rather than printed out coupons. So they're still getting them those advertisements and those coupons that they want, and they found that those individuals will lock in as shoppers and be loyal to the store when they get the things that they want. But they mix in random stuff like Gatorade coupons or toilet paper or Kleenex or whatever, right? Just random stuff that's completely unrelated to this thing that this organization knows about you as a consumer.
Awesome. Yeah, now we're going to talk a little bit more about like the emerging technologies and how those are kind of being utilized. And so I'll turn it quickly back over to Matt.
Yeah, and we like to show this little comic. Substitute here instead of information technology, you can substitute, data or data literacy. A miracle occurs, and all of a sudden you have some value or some competitive advantage. And as I mentioned earlier, and as Gray have been discussing, this is not obvious. This is not trivial. This is not easy. And so, yes, there are some explicit things that need to happen there in the middle to make this miracle occur.
And one of the most popular ways that we're kind of seeing, and it's become sort of exponentially more popular, we'll talk more about it education-wise here in just a little bit, is data analytics. Like, and that term kind of gets thrown around to kind of encapsulate everything. And so we've tried to define it here kind of along the lines of how we understand it or how we would use it when kind of talking with our peers or outside audiences. So analytics is a science, right? It's a science of analysis, right? And as Matt alluded to, it's difficult, just like the scientific process. We're going through sort of all these checks and learning like, all right, what are we seeing in the data? What might that mean? What questions might we want to ask or answer? And then based upon that, what data do we know need to go and get and collect? And really, a lot of this is made for decision making or to go up that sort of spectrum that we saw earlier. But in the emerging technologies, the two big buzzwords that I hear all the time, artificial intelligence and machine learning. Well, both of those tools are grounded in hopefully effective data analytics, someone who has gone through and thought deeply and worked hard on the models that go into those things, because it's just this idea that tools can learn. Well, they have to have a solid foundation, which comes from us, the programmers, the data analysts, the statisticians, the econometricians in the econ world. And it can only be as good as the things that we program into it, the data that we feed it, because it's constantly making decisions based upon the data that you've given it. And so if you give it faulty data or bad data, it's going to give you back bad results, or it's going to learn ineffectively. I think of artificial intelligence as one of my sophomores. If I say something incorrect in class, they might just repeat it back to me, even if it's wrong, rather than think about it. And so that's kind of how we think about it when we're thinking about data analytics and how it's being used sort of across the world for emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, things like that. And so now we have a few questions we're going to kind of pose unofficially in the chat. I'll let Matt do it, and then we'll do officially through a poll, just to kind of keep you all thinking and involved, hopefully.
Yeah, so you talk data literacy, data analytics. As we're transitioning into this emerging or emergent tech, we can think about how things have really changed over time, how value has been created from things that we didn't necessarily predict, how industries have been completely changed because of use of data and technology. And I'll read out these questions. I'll give you just a second to think about it, and I'll tell the answer, and then we'll have, as Grace said, a poll about the bottom part here. But so the world's largest taxi company owns no taxis, made possible through technology and use of data. Of course, Uber, right, is the answer to that one. The largest accommodation provider owns no real estate. Another one that's probably pretty obvious, but again, the use of data and the use of platforms to create this marketplace, it's Airbnb. The most valuable retailer has no inventory. This one might be a little bit old. There may be an organization in China that's now the most valuable retailer, but when I got this particular one, eBay, right? eBay has no inventory. The most popular media owner creates no content. This one might throw you a little bit for a loop, but give you just a second to think about that. Many of you are probably saying Netflix or something like that, but actually it's YouTube. They don't own, I mean, they may have some stuff that they produce, but by and large, it's creators that provide that content. World's largest movie house owns no cinemas. This one I just gave away is Netflix. And the largest software vendors don't write the applications. This one is usually people struggle with this one a bit. But the answer here is app stores, right? On your Apple or Android device or Samsung device, they provide applications. Yeah, sure, they write a handful of applications, but by and large, these software vendors are providing others applications for you to download on your mobile phones or your computers. So some emerging technologies, or actually we might say emergent, because many of these technologies have been around for a bit, but we are learning as organizations how to leverage them to create some value. And I'm sure there's lots of losing here as well, but Gray already mentioned artificial intelligence and machine learning. Another one that's been around for quite a while, IoT, or Internet of Things, that idea that, little sensors or little tiny computers, let's say in a thermostat, or I like to give the example of organizations like agricultural organizations like John Deere, or in farming, they use sensors out in the fields to know exactly how much fertilizer content's in the soil, exactly how much sunlight is being delivered to the ground, exactly how much water is there, and other types of things that they would care about from an agricultural perspective. And so they can take data from these sensors and make business decisions in terms of what to do next, in terms of, let's say, harvesting crops or fertilizing or watering, or on whatever they do in agriculture. That's not my field, but I think we get the idea. And then AR and VR, or augmented reality and virtual reality. And that's been a really hot area, figuring out how to learn and leverage those emergent technologies and learn from the data that's created from there. And then, of course, the latest metaverse. Just throw that out there real quick, but let's move to the poll and let's see how y'all are using some emergent or emerging technologies.
Okay, so we have poll number 3 launched. Let's see.
Thanks, Alex.
And just wanted to let everybody know that this is a multi-choice question with multiple answers you can choose. Okay, and we have 15 more seconds. And closing the polls. Okay, so we have out of 48% that voted, 57% said artificial intelligence, 57% said machine learning, 53% said Internet of Things, 3% augmented reality, and 10% said virtual reality.
Oh, interesting. That sounds great. That sounds about right. What do you think?
Yeah, it seems on the high end of the scale. So that's really nice to see. I mean, you all, and as ones working at the firms, leveraging these technologies to make decisions and hopefully push whatever business or organization you work for kind of forward. And the fact that you're comfortable with it will only make you more valuable in the future as we kind of talk and go forward into, well, how exactly can we use data to disrupt and transform, and why it might be, again, difficult. So I'll turn it back over to Matt.
Yeah. So, and this is from the Digital Transformation Playbook, but what they've argued here, and you mentioned it a little bit earlier about how organizations have kind of reinvented industries. If you think about historically, or maybe for some firms right now, the company is what you would call they're exporting information, they're exporting communication, they're producing goods or services, and they're directing that in one direction towards their customers. If we transition to the transformational way of thinking about it, you leverage or you embed your organization within these various platforms, or these basically where the customer wants to be met. So whether that's through forums or social media or content consumption or things like Facebook or LinkedIn, the idea, or whatever is relevant to your industry, right? The idea here is it's not a one-way communication any longer. To really leverage the data, to really disrupt or transform the organization and potentially the industry, you have to be embedded in a two-way or multi-way communication or multi-way engagements amongst customers and these various relevant platforms. And the idea here, how do you leverage that data? How do you disrupt and transform? And really, we have to change the way we think about it. We have to change it and determine what type of data that we need. Many of you, again, just think about your own organizations or your own experiences that you've had here. If we think about the left-hand side of this table, the analog or the more historical, or maybe even the present for many of us, right? Even us in education, same. We might have the perception that data is expensive. In reality, if we transition to digital, well, it's everywhere, right? It's continuously generated. How do you leverage it is really the question. It's challenging to store and manage. Well, sure, that still may exist to some extent, but really the idea there is you can store and manage, but then turning it into something valuable. And as Gray mentioned, data analytics, and we'll talk a bit more about that coming up here in just a minute, but turning that into valuable information, asking and answering questions of your data. Analog, and maybe those of us that don't have as much experience in working, or our data literacy is not as high as we want it to be, we might only think of what you would call structured data. So, characters and numbers and tables and like looking at something in Excel, for example. But the reality is that unstructured data is valuable and usable, but having someone with the expertise in order to take advantage of, let's say, networks, or let's say making a meaning out of text rather than just looking at the text itself, like natural language processing, or doing other types of things with what you would call unstructured data, maybe leveraging images, or whatever it may be, more complicated data, having that expertise in order to do that. And then we have what we would call the silo problem, and that exists for many of us, where you think about silo, and you know, sometimes, especially some of our students from the Southwest, they may not know what a silo is. Maybe those of our friends that are from the Midwest might know what a silo is. You drive past a field and you see these towers full of grain. And so in one particular tower, you might have one type of grain, and another tower, you might have another type of grain. Well, the idea there is that silos or siloed thinking, and again, Gray will talk about this a little bit next, but we don't communicate between these operational silos. So maybe it's departments or organizations within your firm don't necessarily talk to each other as well as they could. And so there may be data that could be leveraged in one area of your organization, but the other area of your organization doesn't even know it exists. So how do we connect and create value across these organizational units? And the last one here, you know, historically, we might say that data is a tool for optimizing processes, but in the reality, it's going forward, if we can leverage data not to optimize, but to create value, that would be a big win for organizations.
Awesome. Yeah, and so I'll kind of talk about why does transformation matter, and why might firms not transition or utilize data or embrace the kind of sort of era that we're in here. It's because firms have blind spots, and I see it every day, even at the U of A. Like, it's just, there are a lot of things that have gone well, like well established, or again, like Matt said, siloed thinking. Right? We're kind of very distinct wings of an organization that in the past might not have had to talk to one another, where in reality now it's so easy to communicate and gather data, they probably should be, right, to optimize. Just general resistance to change or fear of change, that sort of moniker that's always out there. It's like, well, I've always done it this way. And it's normal, it's expected. But the problem with that kind of thinking is, especially hopefully we've convinced you over the last, 37 minutes, is, well, if you don't change, someone else is, right? Some other firm is leveraging technology, they're leveraging data to drive and make effective decisions. And that's going to be your competitor. And so your competitor is 1 step, 2 step, 3 steps ahead. When they're much more efficient, they can quickly overtake you. And then you'll go from, right, well, we're well established to now we're 3rd in the market or 4th in the market, or anything like that. Like, other firms might be able to move quickly or embrace talking to one another and making kind of joint decision making. So it's always kind of about thinking about your competition, right? That information is out there and someone's going to try and leverage it, right, to beat you, right? Or hopefully it's you, right? You're leveraging it, right, to tackle the other industry leaders or people in your industry. And so what we can kind of think of is, right, how do we leverage it? How do we leverage both data, disruptive technologies, and strategically think about them to maybe reinvent your business, but also maybe just to modify, right? It doesn't have to be a 180-degree kind of flip or makeover. It's just look for ways to kind of make yourself or your firm more efficient. And now that data is kind of much more available and easily sort of accessible, and I'll talk about the pros and cons of that here in just a little bit, we can kind of talk about, and leads into our next section of, well, current data needs in business and education. So just a quick overview of kind of the landscape of how, at least internally, we're seeing it in kind of an education industry. And it starts with, well, we have a problem. And this visual is a little bit old, which should just, if anything, sell this more, because in 2015-ish, right, 90% of the world's data had been created in the past 2 years. And we have the visual on the right that kind of talks through all the different valuable data points by all of the firms that most of us know. And there's probably a reason we know them, because they're leveraging data to make decisions. And I can just highlight a couple here. So for YouTube, you've got 400 hours of videos uploaded every 60 seconds, right? Over 210,000 snaps. Right, LinkedIn, over 120 new accounts created. Again, every minute that's happening. And that's a data point collected, information that we can use. And so now we're kind of at that point where it's overwhelming, right? I've got so much, that deluge or ocean of a data, And it takes a huge bit of skill to figure out, well, what am I going to do with all this? How can I do it? And so I'll kind of turn it back over to Matt to talk about, well, the needs to be able to do that.
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that, Gray, that there's this need, we need people with these skills. So let me give an example, a little story I can tell here. We mentioned earlier on, this is not easy, right? Working with data and having that expertise is not an easy thing. Organizations struggle with it. We're trying to train up and get people that are positioned well to enter these organizations and create positive value from data. And this data-driven approach to business comes with a massive upside, and these skilled employees are in short supply. So let's give you a little cautionary tale. Caution is so important for individuals, or at least the right awareness about what individual can have about use. Let's these analytics. So let's see. All right. Okay. So there's an organization. I don't want to call it anybody. They didn't actually leverage this in practice, but they tried it. There's an organization in high tech, and they wanted to create a system for identifying these next highly successful individuals to join their organization. And you all know that applying for jobs is a real challenge. There's lots of openings and there's lots of applicants, and so it's challenging not only for the applicant but also for the firm in terms of sifting.
It seems that we have some technical issues with Professor.
Okay. I can talk. Can you hear me? Okay, Alex?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I can kind of pick up because we work together. So yeah, the cautionary tale that he was going to go through was a large firm was trying to, again, effectively identify candidates that applied and be successful at getting them to the firm and having them be happy and productive. And so what they did is they built a machine learning algorithm that used current resumes of people that were working there. It's a sort of a tech firm, so you can kind of think about it. So it programmed, all right, these are the successful traits that we need, right? That this is what a successful person at the firm looks like. And so it programmed it in there, and it had some issues. Well, at that time, who was working in tech? Well, generally older white males. And so when it launched the algorithm to review the resumes, it identified, well, primarily white males, right? The algorithm, because it wasn't effectively programmed, right? And these are the smartest people in the world that would program this, right? It's a very household name, but again, it never made it into real practice. It just made it through beta testing. Right? It was biased, right? It didn't select or bring forward any women or any sort of different races from white. And so that's sort of a cautionary tale of what I like to say, and it kind of leads into the next piece is, let me see if I can go here, is the balance between technical and soft skills. So what my students say is, I gotta learn R, I gotta learn Python, I gotta learn SAS, I gotta learn whatever, right? And I have a million different data tools kind of on the screen that you can kind of go through. And really what firms are looking for, and it's based on a large research study of 50 firms, of 5,800 executives, they found that it's not necessarily just the technical skills, but it's the soft skills that also need development, right? Complex problem solving, critical thinking, right? Sort of a basic understanding of business decisions and leadership. And so this sort of study found that, hey, a ton of people are going to need to get retooled. I think it was 120 million professionals. And you all have already kind of identified, you're working with AI. And so like, we're going to have to get our workforce upskilled. And so I like to caution away from just learn the tool, just learn the tool. If anything, learn to think, and it actually makes the tool more effective. Because when I know what question I want to answer, then it's much easier to tell SAS or Tableau or Python, right, what I want to do there. Rather than just learn to learn, you don't remember things like that. Right? And so just kind of being careful with, we're seeing a lot of students like, I got to learn the tool. It's like, well, if you can't think with the tool, you're going to cause more problems than you might solve. Right? And a lot of that comes with now technology it's so accessible by almost anyone that wants it, which can make it dangerous. I kind of relate it to like handing the keys to the nuclear codes over to just anyone that wants them. Right? Like it can be very, very dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. And the market has sort of adapted here, right? You're seeing these huge trends in data analytics and science, both at the undergraduate and the master degree. So we have the highlight of the master's degree because most of you all here, I believe, based on what we know, have an undergraduate degree. But you can see since 2012, just a massive up sort of spike, exponential growth in the number of programs in data analytics, business analytics, data science. They get thrown around as the same. I generally think as data science is a little bit more statistical based, and the other two are more data analytics, sort of analyzing like what happened, why it happened, maybe a little bit less stats based. And I always show this to the undergrads. If you have this degree, you come out with around a $70,000 sort of starting salary. I believe with a master's from MIT, their data revealed it was a little bit over 100,000. That's just coming out, and it's because in these programs, yes, they're teaching you tools, but they're also teaching you how to think with the data. Right? And the BLS, so the Bureau of Labor Statistics, is where kind of the econ world is. It's shown sort of a 27% or predicted a 27% growth in jobs around data analytics up in the next 3 to 4 years. All right, and then the last piece, if Matt wants to come back and finish it off, we're on the last slide. How best practices for working with data.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, good. Sorry about that all. So we mentioned the whole time, right? This is not an easy thing. So what we've seen in industry and best practices is, first of all, have a strategy. We talked about that deluge, right? You have to have a strategy for how you're going to collect it and how you're going to do your analysis. It cannot be just a random free-for-all. You have to know what you're looking for. You should try to automate the data collection and spend less time. The challenge there is that, again, we have that deluge, we have multiple sources of data, we have data that maybe is not clean, and so if you have dirty data, you have incorrect insights. And so that process, if possible, should be automated, right? The buzzword of big data has been thrown around for years. Well, big data is high volume, high variety, and high velocity. And if you've got to automate that so that you can make use of it. Know your data and why you collected it. So get rid of that deluge problem. Know exactly what you need. And therefore you don't get, let's say, paralyzed by the overwhelming amounts of data that you're trying to analyze. And then, this one should be obvious if we talk about data-driven decision making, but we have to supplement that experience, right? So experience is absolutely critical, and we don't want to discount that. But besides experience and so-called gut insight into organizations and decisions, use the data, ask and answer questions of the data, and then that can inform the experience to make decision making.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll quickly go through just a kind of a case study. Like Eller is doing this, right? If we think internally, and Matt and I are a large part of this team, where we wanted to figure out what our undergraduate students needed tech-wise, skill-wise in their internship. So we, knowing what we wanted to know, built a survey based upon that. We got responses from around 700 of our students. Luckily, our students work everywhere, like all the kind of big names that most people identify with. We've placed a student with those firms. And so hopefully it's representative of a little bit of what those firms are using, primarily juniors in their internships to do. And we found basically, they're starting with a foundational understanding, right? A use of Excel for basic data management, cleaning, visualization. Right? We've seen over the last couple of years, visualization programs like Tableau and Power BI have become more popular. They're also using databases, some analytic programs through Google, which is really nice. And I guess we won't launch the poll here just because we want to go into Q&A for you all. But we're kind of building this approach out where we're teaching our students. We start with the foundational things that a lot of people don't think are technologies, right? But creative document design in Word, I mean, technically Word's a technology. Excel is kind of the big one because that kind of is our workhorse and we see it all the time. But then we have Tableau. We're leveraging Adobe as an Adobe school. And then within each major uses different programs. So we're building technology training tutorials. Again, always we have a question to answer it. How do we do that with this tool? And to be honest, they can do it in any way they want. I'll stop here, but I have some past successes. If people want to see it or anything like that, I can talk about it during the Q&A. And if you're interested in Eller and all the things that we're doing, we offer a ton of ways to skill up regarding data and other things. So we have all these Eller graduate programs that we highly recommend. And yeah, I think we'll kind of stop there if that's okay and take any questions.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Professor Hunter and Hashim, for this very informative presentation. We did, in fact, receive a couple of questions. So let's start off with the first question that says, how does data analytics lead to better human services nonprofit decision?
How does data analytics lead to better, what was the second part of that?
Human services / nonprofit decisions.
Gray, do you want to take it or do you want me to take it?
I could take a little bit of it. So I actually had a graduate student or an undergraduate student write her honors thesis that worked with me on grant writing applications for nonprofits. And a lot of the time we spent was figuring out, one, where do we find all the grants? And two, how do you learn how to write them? And so what she ended up doing was basically putting together, collecting the data on all the different sources and the qualifications and centralizing it in one sort of very easy, I wouldn't say it's easy, but large manual that was much more efficient, that walks you through like, here are the current stumbling blocks, here are the different types of organizations that are allowed. And we didn't pursue it as in depth, but a lot of it was kind of broken down on, well, collecting data on what a firm might want, depending upon what the nonprofit is focused sort of on. Again, that's going to be varied because there's thousands of different topics and each are going to be different, but collecting data on the audience, whether that's internally, like where can I get donors, or externally, where should I market different events to make sure turnout is high, things like that. So that's just a couple examples. And I don't know if you want to add to that, Matt.
Yeah, the only thing I might add it, and based upon, I worked with some MBA students earlier this spring, and this question reminded me of something that one of the students asked me about. And I think a big part that adds on to what Gray just said, because I completely agree with what Gray said, is making use of some just basic visualizations. And if you can, take the data that you have and create something simple, start with a simple visualization that paints that picture, that picture tells 1,000 words, or however that saying goes. Creating some visualizations that can really illustrate let's say the drive or the need or the urgency of the goals of this nonprofit can help with reaching those that perhaps might provide resources or funds or help them solve a particular problem. So they don't have to be super complicated. You don't have to have advanced expertise in some certain fields, but just some basic visualizations can go a really long way in terms of helping an organization out, and can really supplement, as Gray said, like the grant writing process or the proposal process.
Yeah, and to add on to that, so some people think technology expensive. Well, we actually leverage what we call Tableau Public in our undergraduate and MBA classes, and that's free to everyone. And so anyone can get access. They can download the app, and it has almost all the features. The only big drawback is it doesn't connect as well to as many sources as the paid for version, but it is free. And Same thing now with like Google Sheets. You can use that for kind of data management. And so roadblocks like access to the technology are much smaller now. And so leveraging that when funding might be much more difficult is nice. So identifying that can help.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, the next question says, how do you see the perspectives of business analytics, how far it goes in your idea, and do you think laws will be working against it or in favor of it in the future?
But Matt, take that one.
I want to take the second part of that about laws and working against it or for it, because one of the things that many of us talk about, and I'm sure firms talk about this as well, is this line between illegal and ethical use of data. And especially in some countries, this ethical use is not always very clear. And so organizations want to create value, obviously. But if there's an unethical use of that data, then that's crossing the line in terms of, may not be illegal, but unethical use of data can create some problems, image problems for the firm, obviously, let's say problems for the consumers in terms of crossing some perhaps privacy lines or something like that. And so I think what we're seeing from a regulation perspective is that organizations like the European Union are kind of leading the way on this aspect in terms of regulations are always going to be catching up, right? We're going to continue doing cutting edge things with technology. The next thing is going to be invented tomorrow. But so regulations are catching up and trying to catch up with these particular problems. But I think that onus is not only on the regulator, but the onus is also on the firm to make sure that they're not crossing that unethical boundary. And if you want to repeat the first part, or Gray, if you want to supplement my response.
No, I think it's always going to be reactionary because, I mean, if you think 10 years ago and try and forecast what we're seeing now technology-wise, I don't know that I could have done it, right? And think 10 years now, and we've already advanced up the scale. And so I think it will be reactionary, and partly will be on the firm to kind of monitor itself internally, not to cross that ethical line. Will it happen? I'm sure it will happen. So we have to do our best to hopefully be one step ahead. But I do think laws will be very kind of reactionary to feel like consumers are being protected and no lines are being crossed that we don't think should be crossed. And it's going to always be a debate, I think, based upon what shows up.
Okay, perfect. And we do have a little more time. So the next question would be, what does the organization intend to ensure its data remains accurate, trustworthy, and complete?
I'll start. It should have hopefully a qualified person working with the data, and they should not be siloed. So that person should be involved with as many parts of the organization as possible. It needs to be kind of a team input in terms of especially identifying problems or understanding what data they have to try and make decisions, because that's, again, not going to be clear for everyone working there. And so you want someone that you're confident that has worked with data before, has gone through effective training that was rigorous, but also can kind of ask good questions that are related to the business. And so a team of quality assurance should definitely be involved. And it shouldn't just be, again, well, the data people are the data people. Well, the best value or the most value is going to be created when the data people are working with the management team, the CEO, CFO, like understanding what the firm is doing on all the different levels and can make recommendations based upon that. But yeah, someone that you can trust and has gone through hopefully a rigorous and I guess checked background.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Only thing I would add to that is just statistical biases can come into play for many unintended perspectives, or there's lots of unintended consequences that can come out. So just having that rigor, that training, that knowledge from a statistics background is vital.
Okay, well, thank you so much again, Professor Hunter, Professor Hashim. We truly appreciate the opportunity to have you present for the Ivy Exec audience. Thanks so much for a wonderful presentation. And I would also like to thank you all for joining us today. We'll make sure, as mentioned, to share the recording of the webinar in the coming days. And I would also like to wish you all a great rest of the day. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thanks.